my great privilege to introduce you to our special guest today, Dr. Marie Battiste. Dr. Marie Battiste is a full professor in the College of Education at the University of Saskatchewan. She is Mi'kmaq and from the Potlatch First Nation. She has pursued research advancing Indigenous education, social justice, and institutional change through the decolonization of education, in particular with emphasis on teacher education and curriculum, and post-colonial educational approaches that recognize and affirm the political and cultural diversity of Canada. She holds graduate degrees from Harvard and Stanford universities and a teacher certificate from the University of Maine, Farmington. She has widely published books, journals, chapters, and reports, and is a widely acclaimed international speaker on Indigenous and decolonizing education. Please welcome me in joining Dr. Marie Battiste.
I say Gwe and to all my friends all across Canada and at Western University. I think at this point I'm going to get the group to share their screen with me so that I can begin to bring up my PowerPoint presentation. So with that, I'd like to recognize, as you have, the territories on which we are located today. And I'm in Treaty 6 territories, homeland of the Métis in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And so I'm a visitor on this particular place. I recognize the traditional peoples and the stewards of this territory that of this university, Western University, and the peoples who have been the stewards of these lands and taken care of them, and those who have been most recently the occupying stewards for this land, as well as to those who have entered into the treaties in the various townships of Ontario and in surrounding areas. So I offer that beginnings to also, as I start my talks often, I find that no matter where I go across the country with my talks, whether I'm talking to presidents of universities or public, I find that people are always still queasy about the terminologies of Indigenous peoples. And partly that is because of the ways in which we have been named by other people, and that we also and have been and have our own names for ourselves. And so the names that we have are all very different and come from within our languages. And so oftentimes people need to learn about what those names are and how to say them. In the terminologies in Canada, however, we were recognized through these words, Indigenous peoples. And Indigenous peoples I have used in my writings, especially when I'm bringing in the international domain. So when we're with Maori or in other places across the country, Indigenous peoples have been the terms that they have used, especially as they have used that and decided on those words for their UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the S on the peoples is important because it refers to the collectivity of people and multiple peoples of collectivities that have existed all across the world. In Canada, our communities have been, in the last decade or two, been known as Aboriginal peoples. And those Aboriginal have included in the Constitution of Canada Indian as a word for status and non-status, although at this time, most Indigenous peoples in Canada and other places have not used the word Indian, and or in Native is another one of those words that haven't been used. Although in the United States, Indian and Native are often used in other ways. So, we're thinking about the Canadian case. So we have the Métis and the Inuit who are part of those Indigenous peoples. And within those, we have our collective communities for which we have First Nations. And sometimes those First Nations have their own names to them. Eskasoni Budladek is my First Nation that I come from, even though I'm Ulnu, which is what we call ourselves. But also we've been known as Mi'kmaq, or since 1974 as Mi'kmaq. And Mi'kmaq and Mi'kmaq are both the adjective and the nouns for who we are as peoples. And so these terminologies are really important for us to understand, especially when we begin to work on issues around indigenization and working toward those. I often draw upon the work of my friend Greg Younging, who has now since passed away, but he wrote this wonderful book called Elements of Indigenous Style, a guide for writing by and about Indigenous people. And so this book helps writers who are working with, I'm trying to decide on terminologies, what they should use. And so he does give you then a clear indication of how you use these words and gives you guidance with that. So I think it's a really important thing that everyone should have as a writing tool, whether you're Indigenous or not. So as I begin my talk today, I'd want to take this quote that, in fact, I've now even forgotten where I've gotten it. One day I shall have to go back and taking a look at where I received this from. But taking stock of one's relative position of power, privilege, and disadvantage, it suggests to me that we each, every one of us, have various places in which power, privilege, and disadvantage entered into our lives, but we each must take responsibility for change in ourselves and within the systems and where we work. And so this is where I would like to begin kind of an opening theme to this particular presentation. I would like to take and recognize in Mi'kmaq language, Dan Wedebeksi. Dan Wedebeksi is always an important place where we begin to situate ourselves, to locate ourselves, to where we begin. Mi'kmaq people began, in our creation stories, and our creation stories tell us how we began and how our ancestors laid on the ground for 4 seasons and then rose in a consciousness, and then learned about their environment first, and their ecology before they became standing people. And then from there, we then learn about our ancestors, our relatives, and all the people with whom we were connected. Our relatives, our grandmothers, our deep rooted relatives with the land and with the environment, the plants, the water, the pipe, and so on, that were delivered onto us in those particular creation stories. Dagwedabetsi is from Bodladek First Nation. I'm also a member of Unamagi and of the Mi'kma'ki of our 7 districts in our territories in the Atlantic provinces. My parents, John and Annie Battiste, I grew up in the language with them. But as I grew up also off reserve in the United States during the time when my parents left the reserve during centralization, it was a period of time when our people were thrust into residential schools and also put into centralized reserves, and without consideration of who they lived with and how they lived over time. And so my parents left at a period of time to just simply make some money over a season, but ended up staying for some 20 some years, during which time I was born in the States. And as a result of our growing up there in a territory that would belong to Mi'kmaq people, I am both a First Nations on the Canadian side, and also I am Mi'kmaq and federally recognized on the United States side. So this kind of dual citizenship is something that I have earned as a part of our family. The land of the Mi'kmaq stretches from all over the Atlantic provinces, from the Newfoundland right through to the Gaspé, which is the Quebec area, and into Nova Scotia. Ebegwid is Prince Edward Island, and also into New Brunswick. And these lands, when you know where you come from, you know that all these lands that are named are the places where your people, our people, were living and raising their families. And we have a long family narratives of these particular lands. My parents also, during the time when we moved to the United States, my sister was just starting of the age to go to school. And at that time, my parents hadn't gone to the residential schools, but they had decided that because they needed to go to the States in order to have their to work and to earn money to pay for the bills that they had, they brought my sister to the residential school, and she was there for 3 years. And it was that kind of background of my sister being in the residential school. Eventually, when we brought her home, she was traumatized by that experience, and we lived with that as a backdrop all through our lives, helping her to struggle. We all struggled in terms of having that as a foundation for her beginning years. And that takes us to the fact that, that residential schools was something that was going throughout Canada, and that over 150,000 children, Aboriginal children, went to over 100 schools across Canada. And these were led to these failures of these lost knowledges and the lack of connectedness to their communities, to their language, to their families, to their culture, to their Indigenous spiritualities, to their Indigenous humanity, to their livelihood in which their families had lived through the sciences that they had learned by living on the land, their knowledge systems. And it was the time in which we begin to see this nature of something that my husband once talked about was nihilism. I had to go look it up. But nihilism is really the word that we use when we think about meaninglessness. It's kind of when people came out of those residential schools, the impacts were so immediate on them, and that they absolutely had an emptiness that came from the empty losses that they had with not having family, not having community, not having the love and affection that they would have gotten within those particular families, leading to this incoherence in their lives. And as a result of that, we saw during these many years of our community suffering from those particular kinds of nihilistic feelings, trying to recover and ground ourselves again in who we were, and grounding ourselves in the knowledge that we had still within those communities. But it took many long decades for us to go through those kinds of recoveries. And on the other hand, when we look at what Canada was going through at the time, there were those who had gone through believing that this was an acceptable way of treating Indigenous people, because they had long been taught in their education that Indigenous people were somehow these primitive people that needed to be educated to the the innovative modern society world in which Eurocentric education began. And so our people were thrust into a period of time where we were stuck between understanding our own communities as well as trying to figure out what these other communities that along the path our own community elders had been struggling with over those years. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out. Oh, I am taking this. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out with a report, and then they also noted that the impacts of the residential school were immediate but also ongoing, and that the Canadians had been denied a full and proper education as to the nature of Aboriginal societies and the history of the relationship between Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. So when we look at the kinds of things that Indigenous or Aboriginal peoples have in terms of how we are a lot alike, and this was something that I was to discover when I went to school. And part of my education, even as I went to Harvard University, I came from Maine, and I only knew what my own Mi'kmaq people, and at the time were Maliseets and Passamaquoddies in Maine. And I thought that the situation that we were taking on there was unique to us and unique to the governments that we were working with. But really, what I came to find by meeting Indigenous people from around from the United States and Canada was that we shared a tremendous uniqueness about us, but that we shared something that was very much made us friends from the very beginning. And part of that came from the fact that every one of those peoples, whether they were people coming from the Navajo reservation or whether they were coming from a reservation in Alaska, that we were all place-based cultures, that our land and the lands we came from defined us as peoples, defined in part our languages, so that we knew particular landforms and landscapes and animals that were part of those in unique ways that other places did not have. And across all of those various groups of people, we had a worldview that, while it was in flux and change, it was dynamic and growing, and there was much to share in all of those different kinds of worldviews that came from all the different Indigenous people. And as time would have it, while we talked about it as culture at the time and language at the time, it wasn't until later into the 80s and 90s that we actually began to use the word knowledge as Indigenous knowledges. That before that time, we were talking about ourselves as in the anthropological terms that were often laid out on us as these are cultures. And that, non-Indigenous people did say, oh, we don't have culture. You have culture, we don't have culture. We're just, who we are. I'm a kind of Heinz 7 kind of person. But Indigenous knowledges was something that came later in time as a way of thinking and talking about what people had as a basis of living within those particular places, those place-based knowledges and how people lived in those particular places. And the other thing that came about was that in all of those places, there was a relationship that people talked about, relationship within their families and their collectivities and with their animals, with the people, with the stories that talked about various kinds of characters and icons that were part of who we were as Indigenous people. And they came forward and they taught us the lessons and teachings that came within understanding those particular iconic characters and important people that were part of our beginnings. in all of our indigenous people, there was depths of resilience, and people talked about the horrors that they went through colonization, through the policies in the States. As then I began to learn about the policies in Canada and how they were mirroring each other, with some things happening 25 years later in Canada after the US took up these particular things. Also, what we found was there's a lot of authentic learning that arose by virtue of the kinds of experiences people had in the lived cultural experiences they had. But the other things that we all grew to know as a basis of our coming together as Indigenous peoples, to recognize how colonization was a aspect of all of our lives, and that colonization create the depth of tragedies that happened in our communities, and it marginalized the people and sometimes erased them from particular lands or moved them off those particular lands. It increasingly creates senses of powerlessness and exploitation, racism, violence, and cultural imperialism. When I go back to looking at some of the work of Iris Young, for example, The Five Faces of Repression, I recall all of these were part of my learning at Harvard and Stanford. And as I began to come to grips with what colonization had done to us as people, one of the things that was an aha moment to me was when I realized that this colonization and this Eurocentrism was something that we'd all had been marinated in. And it was a way in which we began to see the world. It was a way in which that marination of our understanding of ourselves was erasing who we were, came by this particular kind of knowledge system. And this knowledge system, and when I was reading the work of James Blount, talked about Eurocentrism as a European center characterized by superiority, progress, hegemony, and a monopoly over all knowledge systems. It wasn't the only one that existed, but it was the only one that was perpetually put forward through various institutional elements of disciplinary knowledges, as well as schools and universities. And even as I went back to look at what was the origins of liberal universities, it all began with Greeks and math and geography and geometry and, these philosophers and the stars and so on. And I began to realize how much of this Eurocentrism was really grounded in the actual Eurocentric knowledge system, which is indeed a knowledge system, but is one that has been the monopoly over all others. It has been characterized as a singularity in notions of universal. And that's one of the things in which that as we look at the growth of knowledges, we begin to see that knowledges that as they moved out, came out with the ways in which British colonialism took it to India and took it to Africa, took it to all the nations of the world, and created these institutions, which then began to grow into these notions of disciplinary knowledges. And that every time, we were to study what our particular problems and issues are, it was like, oh, but here's the solution to those problems came from somewhere else, somewhere in some book or somebody's theory, or it came from outside of ourselves. So we were always thinking about how we were to deal with our things, but we weren't really dealing from within. They were offering us how to do it from outside and giving monies to help people to think about how they could draw upon those particular theories. So what this began to, in my mind, to think about was when I was working at Stanford University. And Martin Carnoy was one of my teachers, and and we were looking at cultural imperialism as one of the courses that I took, cultural imperialism in education. And it was during that time I had another one of those aha moments when I said, you know, yeah, you can take all these cultural things around us and we can begin to see how things change by bringing in all this cultural change. But when you do something to the mind, when you take away a person's language, when you take away their way of thinking about the world in which they're living, that to me led me to, at the moment I was writing that paper in my doctoral studies, to cognitive imperialism. So cognitive imperialism was a kind of form of brainwashing that came with Eurocentrism and cultural imperialism. And some of those different kinds of ways in which cultural imperialism came through was how we thought about the West. And then it was then Western education, it was modernism, it was innovation that came from the West. It was Occidentalism. It was Edward Said talking about even Orientalism, and how through his study, he found that actually the West was defining itself by pointing out its difference by looking at the Orient and the Orientalism and then describing themselves. So basically, the West became a known entity to themselves as in contrast to indifference with a particular group. And so whiteness then became this thing to which many people would give up the last names, change their names, change their where they came from, so that they could then become part of the hegemony that whiteness then began to exemplify. Over time, it's come to be viewed as white supremacy and white capitalist patriarchy, as Bell Hook talk about it. And Elizabeth Minnick was one who I loved it when in the days earlier in 1990, when I found the word hierarchical invidious monoism. And that is these hierarchies of knowledge systems, invidious meaning unjust, and the singularity of monoism was, and so she was talking about it in terms of feminism and how in the world that half the world was really all about men's knowledge and not about women in there. And she was talking about it in a feminist view, but these all, represented these particular kinds of knowledge systems and ways of knowing. So cognitive imperialism, this word that I, have used over time, has been part of the work that I've done, has gone back, is describing the mental, emotional, and destructive traumatic effects of the experience of individual peoples forced to be educated and living within Eurocentrism, colonialism, and imperialism. And this form of cognitive manipulation has been known in the literature as many things over time. Now, I've talked about it, cognitive imperialism. There are people who, like Freire, who talks about the banking machine, the banking systems. Cultural imperialism was Carnoy, mental colonialization, colonization, culturalism, cultural racism, epistemic violence, cultural genocide, cognitive assimilation. All of these things represent similarities of the same kind of thing. So what I came to learn over time was cognitive imperialism really defined success. It defined it as, and oftentimes I would give these presentations and people would say to me, "Oh, you are so good at talking. You're so accomplished. You're such a role model to your people." And I thought, well, it's only because you think by the way I talk, because I sound like someone else, that basically you're saying I'm, the good thing and I can represent the white voice and so on. And I'd say, no, I can talk the talk, but I'm not a knowledge keeper. When we look at Myrna and others in my community, they're the knowledge holders, the knowledge keepers. I can talk to why that's important, but I'm not the knowledge holders from those particular communities. I am making the trans-systemic connections between Indigenous knowledge and Western or Eurocentric knowledge systems. But over time, our people have come to recognize that success was only defined by whether we could speak English, whether we could move through the academic system, whether we could get up into what was called higher education. And I recall going to a conference once in a where was it, in outside of Canada, US. Anyway, and the people there said, I don't understand why it's higher education. What makes higher education higher? And I thought, you're right. It isn't higher education. It might be post-secondary education, but definitely not higher. But what it really meant was that success is a hegemony of these Eurocentric values and norms, languages, graduation rates, employment rates. And when people didn't feel like they got there, they called themselves failures, even though they were the ones in the community holding on to the language, holding on to families, holding on to the customs, traditions, the spirituality of our people, and keeping and holding on to those as knowledge holders, and yet feeling like, I'm sorry, I don't speak English, and so and so on. And we'd always have to say, that is not what makes success or makes us that makes our knowledge systems less. So what the cognitive imperialism does, it really normalizes multiple oppressions that we know that are raced and classed and gendered, and they are in the discourses and actions and curriculum that are both overt and hidden, and in the narratives and the discourses of the other that oftentimes at universities don't hear themselves. And so part of what I'm talking about here is how we need to begin to understand what those particular narratives are. Recognizing that cognitive imperialism has eroded our collective identities, our Aboriginal and treaty rights, our multicultures, our diverse languages, and our knowledge systems that are still there, but yet they have been eroded or in some places erased with the languages of many Indigenous people across Canada. In 1988, I remember they were saying there were 72 Indigenous languages in Canada, and at present, I think that they are now talking about less than 60. So somewhere along that path, some languages now are no longer being used, not being taught, and they are in some form of recovery. So cognitive imperialism also establishes the deficiency narratives of others. And what in some of the research I've done and looking at the ways in which in our books and textbooks, we've done some research looking in our Indigenous Humanities book, and the work of Nancy Peters, which looked at the ways in which narratives of Mi'kmaq people from the time of the colonial contact onward were multiple layers of differences that described us from dirty to primitive to savage to wild to rebellious to and so on. And all of these narratives continue to reverberate in textbooks, in the media, in news, in textbooks and other places, and we're still confronting those particular places. And part of it is we are seeing that across Canada, we're still trying to educate the Canadian public to recognize that when we're talking about societal structures that are present, whether it's government, employment, education, justice, health, and so on, that the assumption is that they are inherently fair and just. And so what we have is where there are some differences, where there's some injustices happening, we can use equity, the equity model, to correct all of that. In other words, we can keep it, but we can just correct all those people that are doing us wrong, and giving them some anti-racist education, and it'll be corrected. So, but basically, these are fair places. But basically, the last years uh, show us that we are still dealing with unfair and unjust systems. There's also a thing about which, and I've taught teachers for the last 28 years, and a lot of the teachers that I teach are not all Indigenous teachers. In fact, for the most part, I've taught non-Indigenous teachers, and they are unable to see, and sometimes unwilling to see, even after they've been given the proof of it, to see that the structures that we live with are privileged and give unfair advantage to certain groups of people, to certain people of different colors, who have different socialized patterns and so on. And so they are sometimes the word used to be colorblind, but what colorblind really means is that they are power blind. They do not see the power behind the particular structures that they have come to see as fair and just. Over time, some of the work that I've also had is the work of Hansen and Hansel, great piece that talks about blame frames and how blame frames come about, and how in those particular blame frames, society utilizes multiple layers of blame frames in order to, based on this assumption that the other, are basically either inherently or God chosen to be the way they are. That was the original reason that in the papal bull of 14, whatever it was, that said that that the reason why they could go out and to colonize these particular places is that these people needed God, needed their tutelage, needed to have, and their purpose was to take that word out and to bring it to Indigenous people, and as a result of that, they would be then part of the chosen, or would learn from the chosen people. Their cultures were either thought of as backward or primitive, that they had deficiencies that were either cultural or individual, that they suffered because of their cultural disadvantage or deprivation over years, or that they were just hanging on to these structures that actually could not progress. So part of our universities over time have been dealing with these particular areas, and we were realizing how over the 40 years or more, 50 years, that our programming in our institution has changed. And largely, a lot of it has been in these transition programs, counseling, and initiatives that were promoting Aboriginal success through access, through retention, through different kinds of interventions for Indigenous people. And that had a building block when we looked at some of the work that that Alex Wilson and I have did a paper in 2010 to look at the different kinds of models. And the first model that we had was one, and we looked at was the the enfranchisement model. Is that basically if you could speak English or French or was good character, you could get enfranchised and therefore give up your indigenousness and lose that and join this, the progression of this Western society. There was Native studies that was brought in for a period of time, largely was built around various kinds of disciplinary knowledges like anthropology, law, sociology, literature, and so on. And a lot of people were trying to, develop through those particular areas Native studies. There was the student support models that were for Indigenous students. All of these that were kind of needs based. What was the problem with the capacity of these students, and how do we correct those with some interventions so they come through. There was a dual program models, so like Native study, the cohorts. Oh my God, I'm crazy. No, really. Okay, so meanwhile, all of these things are ongoing. Racism is including. So after all of this, there's the resurgence, the aspirations of Indigenous people through the Indigenous knowledge systems. And so it's BARDA. What we're dealing with is this reclamation, and reclamation of Indigenous heritage has been a resurgence that's been ongoing through Indigenous people's work. And that Indigenous people are beginning to find through their own knowledge systems, through their own languages, through their own studying of themselves and working with their own people, have come about to understand the real theory of operating from within Indigenous people's way of knowing. And it's as a reclamation, is an intellectual activation of Indigenous knowledge today that is growing, it's purposeful, and it's political act of empowerment by Indigenous scholars. It involving both deconstruction and reconstruction. The deconstruction is about Indigenous systems being unpacked and the colonial nature of them and the systems and policies that go with it, unpacking Eurocentric superiority to the reconstruction of Indigenous people's languages and their institutions and their structures that come from their own communities. And this is the renaissance of Indigenous people today in terms of doing the deconstructing of all the policies, as well as doing the reconstruction and recovery of Indigenous voice, vision, representation, rights, and unique status. And so right now we're in a place where, and as with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, we're beginning to see that as C-15 is going now through the Parliament, that we still need to recognize that the declaration that was in 2007 accepted in Canada needs to align with the policies of institutions as well as the policies within the federal government and provincial governments. And as we move through that, we'll begin to align these particular places as we move to this resurgence. Our challenges are in terms of indigenization, where we're going to strengthen those partnerships and communities. We're going to build on those particular histories and teachings and languages and protocols and creative expressions. We're going to engage in the critical reflection on colonial history. We're going to operationalize the TRC's calls to action and commit to transformative reconciliation with inclusion and voice and engagement. And we're going to promote and support self-determination, visions, and aspirations. I know we're going to conclude, but there are still some questions that I know that are going to be coming up immediately. So I would like to just to point out is that our indigenization movement that we're working on at the moment is really, when we look at what has happened with equity, diversity, and inclusion, we're really looking at ways in which that has been a way of maintaining or tweaking Eurocentrism while allowing and finding ways to people can access it. So I would say that equity, inclusion, diversity doesn't really change Eurocentrism. What it does is actually tweak it, but it maintains it, while what we're talking about is the inclusion of rights-based education. Indigenous people, through the Constitution of 1982, have a constitutional right and an affirmation that's in that Constitution to Aboriginal treaty rights. And Aboriginal treaty rights are, first of all, those rights that they didn't give up at any kind of time when they entered into any treaty. And it is also things that they also had and never gave up as a result of even living with a Eurocentric society. So basically all those things, plus the treaty rights to fish and hunt and what all has been located within those particular treaties to sustaining themselves in their ways of knowing and being. Those are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we're building on, and what institutions can and should be doing is building not just equity, diversity, and inclusion, but also recognizing the rights that Indigenous people have. And that then brings us to decolonization, the addressing both the exclusions, the privileging of knowledge, and the allowing of Indigenous scholars and other communities to be able to draw upon their own knowledge systems and really build upon and make those a something that they will build for their seventh generation. This is the kind of knowledge systems I'm thinking about, the way in which we think about Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge systems as firmly grounded. It isn't about one meeting the other and that being the bridge, but rather we have Indigenous knowledges that can be totally understood and can come into and work with other systems, but they need to be whole and buttressed in the strength from their own communities, but most of all from their languages that are the tools of the Indigenous knowledge systems. So with that, I'm going to conclude with this presentation, and we will then get into some of the questions, and I think I can come back to some of these other things.
Miigwech, Marie, that was a really insightful overview of the work that we're doing here in the Academy, and I just want to thank everyone and thank you for laying that groundwork out for us, so we can come to this conversation with a deeper understanding of the history and the lineages that we've inherited doing the work that we do in higher education or post-secondary education. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Candice Burnett de Bostegay, and I'm serving currently as a special advisor to the Provost Indigenous Initiatives. And I'll just be taking a few questions before we conclude the session today. It is so clear to me that we could, spend much more time with you to go into a lot more depth. I know there's a lot of questions in the Q&A, and unfortunately, we don't have too much time to get through them. But I wanted to ask you, Marie, a question around Indigenous knowledges. So you've laid out a really strong understanding about the complexity and sophisticated and diverse nature of Indigenous ways of knowing, moving beyond that thinking of culture, which I really appreciated you speaking to. Looking at Indigenous people's knowledges as a knowledge system. I'm wondering what you think the challenges are in bringing Indigenous knowledges into the Academy, into our curriculum. Are there limits to how we do that work in the Academy? And are there risks? Are there things that instructors, scholars, academics need to be thinking about in doing this respectfully?
Yeah, well, I think that part of some of the work that we did in 2000, I have a book called Protecting Indigenous Knowledge and Heritage, Global Challenge, really that talks about the distinctiveness between Indigenous knowledge systems and Western knowledge systems, but how through a Western justice system, it is protecting individual work, it is protecting individual through copyrights, trademarks, and patents, that there are corporations and individuals' work that is protected. But when it comes to collectivities, our protection is not in those particular systems. So our Indigenous laws, our own Indigenous laws, are the ways in which we protect our system. So we need to really raise awareness of Indigenous laws that are the ways in which we both operate within our own system, but also the ways in which we protect our Indigenous knowledges. And not everything that is Indigenous can be put into a Western knowledge system, because these Western knowledge systems are basically thrust around individual kinds of connections, another history, linguistics, and sociology, and political science, and law, and literature, and art, and so on, are all part of different kinds of knowledge fragments of this one knowledge system. And so what we're trying to show is that Indigenous knowledge system as a holistic knowledge system is connected to all things. And so what you can't do is simply take something here and see that it's not connected to something somewhere else. So we need to re-educate those who are working to take that knowledge system about how and why it works within our particular, in our own way and in our own systems. And so there are limits, and those limits are put on with regard to the protocols that we use, the protocols for access and the protocols for dissemination. And Indigenous people know what those are, and you need to draw upon those Indigenous people for those. And they're not always necessarily the same. There might be a bit of a variation across different ways of thinking about these. For those who are in the West, for example, when you are told you witness event, you can go take that knowledge out and you are a witness to it and share. But that's not the case everywhere else. This is not the way to do that. So we need to really draw upon the strength of our own knowledge systems and the structures and laws that are foundational to our groups. And that's why Indigenous lived experience is really the important kind of foundations. Our Indigenous scholars, I want to take you to the Indigenous scholars because this is really important to me. And that is that when we think about indigeneity, there are many of us who can claim our Indigenous heritage and our indigeneity, but that doesn't mean that we have the knowledge that goes with it. So we need to be respectful of the knowledges, where they come from, and to honor those places. And that not only are those knowledges belonging in those particular places, sometimes they belong to clans, they belong to families, they belong to individuals whose stories they belong, and they just can't be taken out and diffused in every direction and lose where they come from or the rights to them. So what we need to do is to be, and part of what I'm working on right now is to rewrite the Protecting Indigenous Knowledge book and to really bring those back into and to think about what that means.
I feel like we could have ongoing sessions on just that topic alone. It's really good to hear that book is being reviewed. It's such a timeless piece and such an important piece as we continue to do this work in the Academy. I'm afraid we are out of time for questions, but I want to say a big miigwech to you, Marie, for your generosity, for your intellectual rigor, and for your spirit. You have been such a trailblazer in the work in the Academy, and you've really laid a strong foundation and have made such a huge contribution. It's such a privilege for me to sit with you today for this short time. I want to thank the audience. We had a huge, overwhelming response, which really says a lot to the work that you're doing and have done from across Turtle Island. Over 900 people have tuned in or were said to tune in today. I don't know what the number was at the end of the day. I want to thank Elder Myrna Kiknoswe, who I'm going to pass it over to in a moment to close us off. I want to thank all of our colleagues behind the scenes who make these things possible. I mean, without your technological savvy, I could not do it. President's Office, to the Office of Indigenous Initiatives, Christy Brissett. Events like this really take a team of people to pull together, and it's clear that we need to continue doing these types of talks after today, because there's lots more to talk about and to share. So I'm going to pass it back to Elder Myrna Kiknoswe to close us off for the day.
Oh, bonjour again. This has been an amazing afternoon. I really appreciated the words that Marie had to share with us. It just gives me new hope and new understanding and the awareness that there's more to come, which is wonderful. It's wonderful because when you talked about way back in the 70s where the control, I remember that. I remember that. I remember the struggles. And it's just like now it's the same kind of struggle, but there's more information. There's more Indigenous people that are stepping forward and doing the work like you have So I really, truly honor and respect you for that work that you're doing. And all of the Indigenous scholars that are there. I'd like to remind everyone to stay grounded to the spirit, stay grounded to the earth, because that's where we get our strength. That's where we get the connection to the spirit, because we're all connected. No matter what part of the world we live on, Indigenous people are all connected by the earth. Everything from the sky world to the earth plane to the underground is right there for us if we are open to receive. And that openness is really important. So I'd like to close off this initial session, because I see more into the future. I see more in the future. And it is that working together that will bring us to a place that we never imagined before. You know, we never knew how far we could go, and we're on our way. So take a moment, reground yourself, bring that calming breath into you, because that's what the Spirit gave us all, that breath of life. So breathe in, you're holding it for a moment, and then you're blowing it out. Breathe in again, you're holding it for a moment, and you blow it out. And you continue your breathing while I close this session. Bashumashumas, Ishkate Makasan Kwandishnikas, Mondo them, Bakajanan Dunjaba, Bodawada Mioda, Nishnabi Kwanda, Niswi, Medewan. Chimigwech, Kaje Manado, for this most beautiful day, this most wonderful life. Chimigwech for guiding us and directing us to all come together as one. One heart, one body, one mind, and one spirit. Say Chimigwech to all of those Nokomasagam and Shomsag that are sitting in those four directions, watching over us, in encouraging us to keep moving forward to that place that we need to take the next generations, so that the future for them is bright and colorful and fully alive in wholeness. Say Chimigwech to all the people who have listened to this, for opening up their hearts and their minds and their spirits to continue doing their wonderful work. And also for the ones who are hearing some of these things for the first time, for knowing that there is truth out there that is far beyond our imaginations, the truth, the peace, the tranquility that we all need in our lives to move forward. I say Chimigwech to all of you for coming, and Chimigwech for taking the time to open your hearts and minds and spirits. Till next time, Nikanagana, all my relations. Aho.
Oh.